Groovy checks. Cool. So, hi, Fi. Thank you so much for coming along to our penultimate climate justice conversation. It's really great to have you here. And yeah, we'll pass over to you to run this session.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to check first that there aren't any accessibility needs that I haven't been made aware of. If you want to make me aware of anything, please feel free to drop it in the chat, either to everyone or just to myself. And yeah, so I'm just going to share some slides. And let me know when you can see my slides. Does it say audience window for you? Can you see the full? That's a shame. Unfortunately, I cannot get rid of that unless I have two monitors. So hopefully that's okay for everyone. And I normally have a larger setup, so I'm just figuring that out. Okay, fab. So this talk is on finding a place in the climate movement. It's an exploration of the climate crisis, how to shape the future, and finding your place within that vision. So this is going to be framed and sort of taking you through my journey within the climate justice movement, focusing in on moments of strength, hope, and joyful resilience, to give the different examples of ways you can get involved, and also to hopefully inspire you to take action as well. So I've got a bit of an introduction thing here, although everyone has checked in already. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide, basically. So this is me. My name is Fi Quekett. I normally go by Fi, and I'm a queer climate justice advocate and organiser. Throughout this workshop, like I said, I'll be using my experiences as a sort of case study in finding your place in the movement. Right now, my primary focus is on making climate activism and education more accessible through digital organising, which is mainly through social media, as well as working on internal strategy and education across the climate movement, which I promise isn't quite as boring as it sounds. I'm also involved in campaigns and movements like Green New Deal Rising, like Emma mentioned, and Fossil Free London, and I hold workshops on things like this, climate-focused topics, as well as deconstructing transphobia in activism spaces, which is, I guess you could say, my specialty area. For a long time, I called myself a climate justice activist. I now identify with much longer queer climate justice advocate and organiser, a bit of a mouthful, so I often shorten it based on context. And what that means to me is that my queerness is a core part of what I do. It helps inform my advocacy on the importance of activism being inclusive, and queer activism is actually where I started out over 6 years ago during my time in sixth form. So I've got a bit of an agenda for today, the green agenda. The intention of this workshop is to explore ideas surrounding climate justice, how to shape the future and find a place in that vision. And so that starts with me going over what we're facing, how do we get here, what's climate justice, and then how we can create change with that in mind. I also touch on inclusivity, because when we're talking about finding our place in the climate movement, that also involves helping others find their place as well, and making space for everyone to be able to get involved. So firstly, a little bit of a background on what the climate crisis actually means for those living on our planet, which I imagine quite a few of you are fairly familiar with. So it means more frequent and more extreme weather events, like droughts, floods, hurricanes and wildfires. We've had the heat waves lately, for example. It means living in an increasingly unstable and unpredictable world with water scarcity, crop insecurity, and conditions in which every year will start to feel like a pandemic year. Rising sea levels, expanding deserts, and other geographical changes will force many people to leave their homes and their entire lives behind. We've got to remember to act compassionately towards these people, especially considering the current hostile environment in the UK that's being driven by our current government. You may have heard some people use the phrase mass extinction. which is defined as a time in which the Earth loses more than 3/4 of its species in a short interval. This has only happened a few times in Earth's history, and it's happening again now. The ecosystems that are critical for the survival of all species are being destroyed at an unprecedented rate, with 1 million species currently at risk of extinction. The climate crisis is already affecting every region across the globe, but those who have contributed the least are the most impacted. Indigenous peoples, for example, protect 80% of the world's biodiversity and will be some of those worst hit by the crisis for many of the reasons I've stated above. Essentially, marginalised people will feel the effects of the climate crisis to a much greater degree, and we'll cover this further when we look at climate justice. But what exactly got us into this mess? This is kind of the first step to figuring out how we then act on the climate crisis and therefore reverse and halt some of the ongoing effects. At school, I and many other people learned about what was being called global warming from a very scientific perspective, showing graphs of global average temperatures rising in tandem with atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, the classic boo to CO2 narrative. This rise is largely due to the burning of fossil fuels, like coal, oil and gas. And it is correct, that's what's been happening. But if we want to stop burning all of these fossil fuels, we also have to understand why they're being burnt in the first place. And they're being burnt in the name of expanding the profits of a privileged few. Take the incredibly polluting fast fashion industry, for example, where huge corporations headed by incredibly wealthy individuals push for more and more consumption to line their pockets. And at the same time as doing that, they're destroying the environment and paying their garment workers less than a living wage. The climate crisis is a direct result of exploiting not just this planet, but the peoples and cultures on it too. And this is why you will sometimes hear people saying, and quite correctly, that it was actually colonialism that caused the climate crisis. Because colonialism was all about expanding global powers and resources to the detriment of our planet and those on it. So it's not all quite as simple as stopping fossil fuels. And colonialism has many faces now, including capitalism and even transphobia, which was used as a tool by global powers to oppress parts of many cultures. Now that may all seem very complex, but what it boils down to is that all of these systems of injustice are linked together, and the climate crisis is a great big symptom of that. And because it's a symptom, we also then have to address the root cause. And this is where climate justice comes in. So climate justice recognises that we can't stop the extraction of fossil fuels without dismantling the unjust systems that caused and continue to drive the destruction of our environment, lives and cultures in the name of extracting resources and profit. It recognises the ongoing effects of these systems as well, that the climate crisis is already affecting every region across the globe. But like I mentioned earlier, those who've contributed the least are the most impacted. Vulnerability to the effects of the climate crisis changes significantly with socioeconomic factors, land use, inequality, and the ongoing effects of colonialism. In the words of Mary Anise Hegler, climate change takes any problem you already had, any threat you were already under, and multiplies it. Climate change is not the great equalizer, it is the great multiplier. And climate justice is about going out and disrupting and dismantling these colonialist and capitalist ideologies that are used to justify practices that lead to climate breakdown. It's about holding those responsible to account and finding solutions that create a fairer, more equal world. It's by no means an easy task, but the more people who help shape this future, the more people whose concerns will be addressed in the world that we are trying to create. And so a bit of an info dump there, but what this leads into is this slide here. This is just a few of the many, many ways that we can help shape that future and create change. So we've got, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. Can somebody confirm that they can see my cursor moving across the screen? Fab. So there's many actions here. Some are more individual, like emailing your MP or buying secondhand. Some are more group actions, like joining your local climate group or attending or organising a protest. Like many people who are concerned with the multiple crises we're currently facing with, I started out with making individual lifestyle changes, like buying secondhand, eating less animal products. I then moved on to emailing my MP with Greenpeace as part of their political lobbying network, and have now sort of transitioned more into large protests. It is a privilege to be able to make individual lifestyle changes, which is where a lot of people start out. But individual action alone isn't sufficient to tackle these crises. That's so often why these actions are pushed by powerful corporations that are responsible for the climate crisis. Just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all industrial greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. And the concept of a personal carbon footprint was pushed into public consciousness by BP's marketing team to shift responsibility. That's not to say that buying secondhand and going plant-based won't help. Mass individual action is a form of mass action, and shouldn't be looked down upon or ignored completely, but that system-wide changes we need will require more targeted tactics as well. So the best way you can fight the climate crisis is by getting involved. Change is not passive. Joining with others to take action as a movement and building those communities with people to make change is so key, because we really can't do this alone. So the first time I joined with others to take action was at a mass cycle. It was along the dual carriageway, which I actually used to go down twice a day on a school bus. I went with a friend of mine who was visiting from Edinburgh, who was completely unfamiliar with the area. And on our way to the start location, I was definitely feeling really tense. I had not taken climate action in this way before. I didn't know many, if any, of the people there, except for my friend. But I actually ended up leading one of the groups because I knew the route so well, and there was a lot of support along the way, which really empowered me to search out other opportunities to get involved. The first action you take, whatever form that may come in, can feel really, really daunting. Sometimes you'll find that the group or the form of action isn't quite the right fit for you, and that's okay. If anything, it's normal. Finding your place in the climate movement can be a really long process. I certainly took my time, and there's absolutely no shame in that. It's really important to recognise as well that protest and taking action can be really fun. I had a lot of fun on this cycle, and enjoying ourselves doesn't take away from our message. It energizes us and allows us to reach new people, because we're not relying on a doomist narrative that really isn't that fun for other people to hear. It helps build resilience in our movements and encourages others to join us. In the words of Rebecca Solnit, joy does not betray, but sustains activism. So that mass cycle was at the end of August 2020. And by August the following year, my climate activism, as I was calling it then, had seriously escalated. I had been involved with the organisation of protests against the now passed police crime sentencing in courts bill, stood outside Leeds Art Gallery half nude on International Justice Day, and headed down to both London and Cornwall to protest with Extinction Rebellion, a group I'm sure many of you will have heard of. And there's me there in the samba band with them, which I found quite fun with my background in music. So there's an example of where I was sort of applying my skills and the things I already knew how to do in that setting. But it was on August the 1st last year that I kind of hit a pivotal point within my activism. And naturally that involved a sparkly green tutu, an oversized paintbrush, and a greenwashing campaign from H&M. So this campaign, which they called Role Models, used child climate activists to promote their so-called conscious clothing range in order for them to bulk up on profits. For a little bit of context, this is a company that's claiming to be sustainable and ethical whilst creating 3 billion garments every year and not paying any of their garment workers a living wage, or at least they haven't provided proof, which is generally a fairly good indicator that they're not. My friends and I decided to highlight this greenwashing in our local H&M store and staged a small protest, designed entirely by ourselves in the front room of my student house in Leeds. We researched some facts and figures for placards, painted fabric with fuck H&M and greenwash, and in my case, designed and stitched almost an entire superhero outfit. Once we were on location, which was back in my hometown, my friend Tomea sat in the window display for almost half an hour because they couldn't actually see her because of these massive greenwashing banners they'd put in their own window. And I donned my Captain Greenwash alter ego, dancing around with an oversized paintbrush in front of the store, chanting about lies and deception. Maybe my musical skills weren't as best used there as in the previous slide. Funnily enough, this got us quite a bit of attention. We were well within our rights to protest. The law hadn't quite changed then, but when a couple of police vans and another car turned up, we decided it was time to head home. I just want to clarify that is actually completely still legal. We were a team of 2 activists, a photographer and a videographer. It was just 4 of us. But by the next morning, H&M had taken down their campaign window display. And that's all it took. We heard about the campaign from a text. We sat in my living room and went, what are we going to do about this? And we made a protest that ended up headlining online on the big issue. But for me, the most important thing I took away from this action was a breakthrough moment in using my creativity as a tool for climate action. Without realizing it, I'd stumbled across the place at which my skills and joys intersected with the work that the climate movement needed. This really great Venn diagram developed by Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who's the author of All We Can Say, which is an excellent book, is an illustration of that. And it's designed to help you find your role within the climate movement. It's really easy to get stuck into the habit of taking on tasks that don't fulfill all 3 of these criteria. What brings you joy? What are you good at? And what work needs doing? Of doing work that accidentally reinforces the systems we're fighting against because they are complex and ingrained in our society. Of picking up tasks that don't suit your skills because you feel the need to be involved with everything all at the time because it's an emergency. Or forgetting to find joy and getting burnt out. Most climate activists have found themselves in this position at some point. Many are still in that position now because it is sometimes quite difficult to recognize what this space is for your climate action, and that's completely okay. Finding your place can be a long process, and almost always it's ongoing because our skills and joys and what the movement needs does change over time as well. But remembering these 3 criteria can make that journey a whole lot smoother. So I'm just going to pause for a second there for people to maybe read it or take a screenshot. There is an Instagram account called Climate Venn, where Dr. Ayana has got all of this information. It's also on her personal social media and the one for the book, All We Can Save as well. And yeah, I'd recommend checking them out. But as you can see from this photo, not every form of action is fun all of the time. On this particular occasion, I was being arrested for what is known as taking what is known as direct action at an Amazon site, one of 15 across Europe that was blockaded on Black Friday last year. Amazon is a perfect representation of our economic system, which is designed to keep us hooked on buying things we don't need at a price the planet can't afford. It's built on criminal, exploitative practices from tax avoidance to worker exploitation, rampant wastefulness, and ecological destruction. They're all linked. I've popped a few examples of these practices on this slide. I don't expect you to read them all. The list is completely never ending. And this is the reason that we target large corporations like Amazon and H&M, to put pressure on corporations to stop the destruction if they want to stay in business, and pressure on the government to stop funding these industries if they want public support. These companies are built for profit. So sometimes the only ways in which they're going to change is if we risk their profit, or we push the government to implement policy that forces them to change their practices. Sometimes their practices will never become sustainable and we just have to abolish them entirely. Direct action is one of many tools that can be used to highlight the harmful and exploitative practices of large, powerful corporations in order to create that pressure. What we did outside of H&M was also direct action. so are strikes, so are occupations. Some direct action like this, more commonly known as civil disobedience, does involve breaking the law and risking arrest. Taking action in this way does not make anyone any more or any less of a climate activist than anyone else. And arrest should never be framed as a goal rather than a consequence of taking these higher risk actions. When we're taking part in climate movements and figuring out where we ourselves are going to find ourselves in these spaces, it's really important to respect everyone's boundaries and identities and how that may inform the types of action they choose to take. This then leads on to the importance of inclusivity. So I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions at this point, because I've realized I don't have the chat up, and there is something in the chat. Oh, no, there's not. Cool. I'll continue. There will also be space at the end for questions that people have at that point. And I'll move on to the next slide now. So this is going to be a bit of a discussion. You can pop things in the chat or unmute yourself. But basically, I want to hear from you about why you think inclusivity is really important in climate spaces and generally in wider like activist movements.
I'll kick off. Should I kick? Can I?
Yep.
I think like from my experience and just like general stuff, like at the end of the day with like climate justice movements, we're trying to build like a better future and like an alternative. And if it's just one group kind of like advocating for like their vision of the future, like not including those other like voices which are not as loud, then we're not going to create an inclusive, just world. And like the reason we're in this mess is inherently because like we've, history, colonialism, let's just do this thing. So we've got to like be unpicking that and unpicking all of those like oppressive systems, which have led to the climate crisis essentially.
Yep, absolutely. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add? Feel free to unmute.
I'll jump in. I read a great book by Michael Mann that was all about like the new versions of climate denial and how people who are trying to prevent climate action are not so much denying that climate change exists anymore, but kind of using other slightly sneakier tactics. And one of the ones they talked about was division. And the idea is that if you can get people within the climate movement to, make each other feel guilty and like decide that you're not as good of a climate activist as I am, then that movement is less of a united force and therefore less effective. So actually being inclusive and like trying to get rid of maybe the traditional environmentalist image that's kind of historically dominated is important if we've got like the best chance and you're trying to get the best possible, biggest possible team, because essentially we're all fighting for the same thing.
Absolutely.
Bella, what's that book called? Is that The New Climate War? Okay,
Yeah,
I'm going to see if the library have got that. Yeah,
would recommend. It was really good, and it's not too like dense and heavy. It's quite readable.
Okay, that sounds very important.
And it's a really great point you make about the sort of image of an environmentalist, because I think one of the biggest barriers to getting involved in climate activism is that it seems like a huge leap, or they don't think they're the right kind of person to get involved, or the activism they're seeing is very much like go and block a road. And actually there's so many other roles and ways you can get involved. And if we kind of show that and show that diversity that we have within the movement, we're gonna be able to break down those barriers for people to get involved, and show that actually it's not just all about doing one type of action or being one kind of person. Thank you for popping that in the chat. Any other points? So Megan has just popped something in the chat, so I'm going to read it out. I think it is super important to hear from a range of voices and perspectives in terms of climate justice, but just more in general. We all have so much to learn with regards to tackling the climate crisis and should give those in marginalised communities and Indigenous communities a platform. Absolutely, yes. Frontline communities, particularly Indigenous people, have been screaming about the climate crisis and the effect that we're having, or these big powerful corporations as well in particular, are having on the planet for years, and they have just been ignored and ignored and ignored. So platforming those who are most affected is really important. So they're often those who know best how to find these solutions or already have part of them already.
Sorry, can I say one more thing?
Go for it. Yeah.
That just reminded me, Megan's comment. So I'm doing my dissertation on the links between gender equality and climate change, and aside from the obvious justice issue, there's quite a bit of research that shows if you have more gender diverse decision-making processes, then you get more environmental policies, you get better environmental policies. They've done studies where they calculate it down to the amount of CO2 emissions that get reduced as a result of these policies, and higher quality governance. So it's actually beneficial for everyone to have, a diverse range of genders represented.
Yeah, and there are studies that show that actually increasing access to education for marginalised genders, and which includes women, is one of the biggest solutions to the climate crisis. Is just better education for people who currently don't have access to that. Yes, Michelle.
Yeah, I always think about this example, or like along the same vein, I always think about this with there's a lot of things like I think it's automatic doors that or like wheelchair ramps. Like a lot of people that aren't necessarily in a wheelchair use wheelchair ramps, and it's only when you take into account those voices that are usually marginalized that we realize that actually there's a solution that a lot of people find convenient, and it's not just wheelchair users. And I always think about that when it comes to the topic of to this topic. Yeah, you basically get like a lot of the solutions that we all enjoy are from listening to people who are differently abled, and that kind of result is probably across all marginalized groups. Like if you listen to a marginalized group, you will probably get a solution that's better for everyone that just no one thought of, because they didn't give themselves the permission to say, oh, I don't want to walk up the steps, I want to use a wheelchair ramp instead.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a quote that I can't remember how it starts, but it says something about standing with each other because we know that our liberation is bound up with everyone. And I can see Emma nodding, so she possibly knows the rest of that quote. But one of the areas which I'm most familiar with is the topic of trans rights. And obviously there's quite a big debate at the moment that is coming up, where a lot of people calling themselves feminists are trying to erase trans voices, when actually improving trans rights involves taking down a lot of patriarchal ideas and values which benefits women. So there's the full quote from Emma as well. So actually, exactly, the fights of feminists and trans rights activists are very, very closely interlinked. So yes, basically when movements are inclusive, they make people feel more safe and secure to be able to express themselves. When people see that they matter in organising spaces, they are more likely to repeatedly show up and share their ideas. In fact, be inclusive is the first of the Hermes principles for democratic organising. The more people who co-create the future, the more people whose concerns will be addressed from the foundational level in this world, which is a quote from Adrienne Maree Brown. And as I've mentioned, one of the ways in which we can make movements more inclusive is by emphasizing the huge diversity of tactics and ways in which you can get involved with the movement. Earlier, I showed you that big image with lots of words about different ways that we can create change. But now I want to focus in on those skills that the movement needs. Because behind each of these photos from various actions I've taken over the past year is an amazing group of people taking action in whichever way they know best, and a community that is working towards climate justice. So in this top corner here, we have the fast fashion industry has blood on their hands protest. At the time, I was the lead coordinator for Extinction Rebellion Leeds Universities, and one of my main goals with that was to work more closely with other societies at the university. So this protest was run in conjunction with the Fashion Society and the Feminist Society at the University of Leeds. And we had this grand idea of how it's going to work. We're going to have a sort of catwalk in front of the student union, and the last part of the protest was going to be myself with my placard saying something along the lines of "won't wear exploitation" across myself and basically little else on my body. However, then about a week before then, my arrest at Amazon happened, and I decided I was not up for that and putting myself in that position. And then it started raining. So we knew we couldn't do this sort of like catwalk type thing outside the student union. We arrived on the day, and through sort of collectively speaking with each other and bringing together everyone's ideas, we settled on essentially walking all the way around the student union in various places around the university as well in a quiet line. One protester had brought red paint to put on her hands, and through a group vote, we also decided that everyone who was comfortable to do that would also do so, which then led to the name change of the protest to "The Fast Fashion Industry Has Blood on Their Hands." So through that process of collaborative listening and changing things on the day with taking opinions from people who generally weren't involved in protest design, we actually created a much better, more impactful protest, which everyone felt that they were a part of. This second image is my Green New Deal Rising image. This is a photo which is from an MP challenge, but in this photo is also sort of a representation of a number of people who take on different roles within the movement. Some people there take on digital organizing, creating social media graphics and posts. Some people there are involved in strategy. And one individual there is responsible for texting people to make sure they turn up to Zoom meetings and find out that there are challenges in their area. It's not all about sort of turning up and talking to an MP. There's somebody behind the camera as well. There's somebody who's coordinated the protest. There's somebody sending out texts and emails and encouraging people to join through social media posts. So that diversity of different roles is what I really love about Green New Deal Rising. And also somebody after the challenge to edit the video. Almost forgot about that because sometimes it doesn't get done. This image third here, I've chosen to sort of show the importance of sort of resilient activism. So this is a photo of myself and a few friends on our way to Calais. Unfortunately, that is a P&O Ferries ferry. Not great. So we went to Calais for a week to volunteer with Refugee Community Kitchen. And I thought by the end of the week, I was going to feel really burnt out because it was a pretty tough environment to be in for apparent reasons going into the refugee camps. It was very heartbreaking to see how people, just humans, were being treated. Like, it was horrible. But actually, because these people were there 24/7 in the warehouse providing support for refugees and migrants and asylum seekers in Calais, they'd created this resilient environment in which actually everyone was really supported and really emphasized that importance of well-being for me. Sorry, I raised my voice slightly. I was at a festival doing outreach this weekend, so struggling with a voice. 2 seconds. So I guess that's another example of things you can do. You can go to a festival and do outreach. Yes, so this image here is of myself. Earlier I mentioned at the H&M protest, but like I said, a lot of things went into that. We had somebody taking photos, taking videos, and that footage was really important and key in making sure loads of people found out about that protest. It was held in a very small town. Without the media attention on it and without the digital organising that surrounded that protest, it wouldn't have reached as many people, and it wouldn't still be haunting H&M to this day. It was mentioned in a Vogue business article just a few weeks back, so they haven't escaped it yet. It was just 4 of us in a small town in the UK, so that digital media element was really key. This image here is from a litter picking session run by Green Action Society at the University of Leeds. I've popped it in there just because of the importance of community. That action was really fun, even though we were picking up litter from our park, because we did it as a group and as a community, and we had a great amount of fun in doing so. It was also raining, and yet still it's one of the most fun things that I've done with the climate group. This image here is from an airport protest to stop the Leeds Bradford Airport expansion. I've included it because it was a success, in part because of the visual elements like this wreath shown here that people brought along. Art is really a key part of activism because it allows us to sort of creatively demonstrate our point, make it more engaging, make it more eye-catching. This is an image from the cost of living crisis rally, the first one in London. Interconnected struggles is a really important thing to recognise within the climate movement. If you're involved with campaigning around the cost of living crisis, that is also campaigning in terms of the climate crisis, because these struggles are connected. And this entire web, if you're pulling at one strand, you're helping collapse the whole thing. And lastly, this is an image from the first time I was arrested. And the thing I found most important about that whole experience was the fact that there was somebody there at the police station when I was released, with food and money and a phone if I needed it, and to contact people and let them know where I was. That was a role that somebody in the local area could just turn up, do, sit there with a book, and be a really important part of that person's process through the criminal justice system. So some next steps. This slide echoes what I showed you earlier with the Venn diagram, but in a slightly different format. There's so many different ways you can get involved with the climate movement. I hope I've managed to demonstrate some, especially in the previous slide. And many of them aren't necessarily obvious at first glance. Ask yourself what skills you have, contact a local climate or other justice group, and ask them what they need. Sorry. Maybe that won't fit your idea of what you would like to do. Maybe you'll decide to try something else and really enjoy it. I did not think I would be involved in digital organising when I first started out. The most important thing to do is get involved, build those communities and movements to fight climate injustice. And if something doesn't feel right to you, speak up. Trust me, I'm renowned for doing it all the time in movements, and feedback is so important. Remember that the more people who help shape the future, the more people will be able to thrive in it. And that includes telling people what you think. Lastly, I want to say that anxieties around the climate crisis, which can often immobilise us into inaction, are completely valid. And recognising those emotions is really, really important. However, building resilience through taking action is often the best way to avoid falling into these mindsets of climate despair and doomism. Taking action is basically the best cure for climate anxiety. And is it going to go? Yes. So thank you. That overran slightly, my apologies. I'm wondering if anybody has any questions, maybe in terms of getting involved. And I'll stop the screen share now.
Thank you, Fi. I put your quote there because it was just so beautiful.
Thank you.
I don't know if you've like said that before, if that came organically, but
It was partially written, but I switched up a bit.
no, I vibe
I
with
work on
that.
bullet points.
I love that. No, thank you so much. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Michelle?
Yeah, I was wondering, how do you balance in a protest or something like that, or any sort of action, how do you balance doing something or finding a message that reaches out to the mainstream and has like, and is practically achievable, versus balancing that with like a more hard line? Maybe there's someone there that being like, oh, we should be more hardline, we should be more left, we should be more whatever. How do you like incorporate their point of view while also being like, well, this is the action that's achievable?
Yeah.
In your opinion?
I think that very much comes down to the specific purpose and intention of that protest and the group as a whole. So my personal way that I approach things is, I think the Plant-Based Unis campaign, which I think you may have had a talk from, is a really great demonstration of that, where they say we want plant-based unis by 2025, 2030.
2023, my love.
2023.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. I remember Bellis asked the question, and we were like, yeah, like if it's shifting the old but anyway, Ollie.
Yeah. It's just normally factors of 5 with the goal, so I slipped into that. Realistically, those universities are probably going to implement those changes step by step. They're going to go, right, we'll do oat milk, and then we'll do meat-free Mondays, and then we'll do no red meat. But by saying from the start, we want plant-based unis from 2023, you don't compromise your message at any point. You say, this is what we want, and this is what we're aiming towards. However, other groups take a different approach, and they go, actually, we're okay with doing that step-by-step approach and being a little bit more palatable. So your messaging very much depends on what group you're part of. In the past, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, slightly less confrontational, we're going to go sit in a road and get arrested groups will side with the slogans that are more possibly palatable to mainstream media, because that's their role within the climate movement. They're equally as valid as I'm trying to think of a typical Extinction Rebellion slogan, because Extinction Rebellion did also increase a lot of public consciousness around the climate crisis, despite their faults, like every climate movement has, because they started those conversations. Even if people were going, you know what, I agree with the climate crisis is urgent, but their tactics are just not right, they still started that conversation. So it's about the intent of the specific group and the specific action you're taking. And it's important to have both. Sorry, did a lot of talking recently. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I like the emphasis that you have on both have a place in the movement. And it's just about like what you're personally comfortable with, or like what you personally, I guess, believe. Yeah, thank you.
Bella?
Yeah, I have a question about the Amazon protest. Did you have a pretty good idea in your head before you did that you might get arrested?
So this is an interesting one. When it comes to arrest and things, there's sort of a scale of risk. At the McDonald's action, which was me standing in the window like that with Animal Rebellion, my intention was to leave before arrests happened, but the police acted unlawfully, didn't give us our due notice, and therefore the case was dropped very quickly. In that case, my intention was not to get arrested, and I didn't intend to. So that was not fun for me. But I did also still know there was an element of risk with doing an action like that. So it's important to kind of recognize that. And it was a similar case with Amazon, except I was aware that there was a much higher risk in that instance. because there were people there doing the physical blocking. I was there as a wellbeing position to give out food and water to people. I knew largely that those people didn't get arrested, but there was a risk. And it was a risk I chose to take, knowing it was a potential consequence. And we were all acquitted, fortunately. There was also a more recent action I did where I knew that regardless of what happened, I was certainly going to get arrested. And that was something that I then put a lot more thought into, because I knew therefore the conviction was also a lot more likely.
How do you kind of weigh that up in your head, if that's not like a huge question?
It comes into sort of weighing up the impact at various points. So the impact on my mental health at point of arrest, because that was quite significant the first time. The impact of potential bail conditions, because you can have various restrictions placed on you, and the impact of having a criminal record, what kind of criminal record that would be, and therefore on your job security. So at the time of McDonald's and Amazon, I was still intending to go into engineering. So I was not really intending to get a criminal record. And I knew that was quite unlikely. The more recent action, which I allegedly took, which I don't know if I'm going to be convicted yet, I knew by this point that I had left behind that career path and that I was going to be in activism full time. So I knew that even if I was convicted, it wouldn't have that impact. For some people, regardless of what they're going into, they don't want that to happen to them. The effect very much changes with marginalised identities. I think a lot of the time people talk about police violence towards BIPOC people in the sense of stop and search and sort of violence at point of police interaction, but that does then also extend into things like bail condition, the criminal justice system, what the convictions look like. So recognising that that's different for everyone at all points of that process.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
Something I'm unfortunately quite familiar with. But something I really emphasise is this, looking at arrest from a very informed perspective. And I think when groups are doing these kind of non-violent direct action trainings and things like that, they really need to be very informative when it comes to how everyone experiences these systems differently. That somebody whose parents may have immigrated here could be affected by the Nationality and Borders Bill that's just gone through, even if they themselves aren't an immigrant. That things have changed with the new police crime sentencing and courts bill, that on occasion my friends have got higher or more intense bail conditions than people doing the exact same action because they're brown and working class. So just being aware of those things and letting other people know that those are risks that they're carrying with them. I think Peter briefly had his hand up.
Yeah, I was just curious on your thoughts on how you talked about employability and that aspect of it, which is obviously only one part of potential repercussions of this, but is it your experience or thoughts that is slightly changing? And yes, there are going to be some organizations for whom that is a real barrier if you want to looking at particular careers, but there are a lot of organizations, especially ones in the climate and social justice world, that there's a lot more understanding around that. Yeah, would that echo kind of your experience?
Yeah, so in my case with engineering, in my contract, it said that they could drop my contract at any point if there was a criminal record that would affect my work. And with things like that are not in the activist sphere, like engineering, they may somehow twist things to be like, oh, it would affect because we think you might be liable to do more actions and get in further trouble or something like that. With my role that's starting soon with a refugee rights charity, they specifically had in their job description that criminal record is not a barrier to working with us. But I will also potentially be working around children, so I needed a DBS check. And there have been actions where, because of security and things like that, activists have been charged with things like assault, which are almost entirely dropped sort of most of the time. But things like that can have an effect because of the nature of those kind of charges, which are intentionally used by police for that reason.
Yeah, no, and I just add, like, I mean, I'm like a little bit less experienced, but like from going to like protests, and like if you're with like a certain group, for example, Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion, who I'm like well involved with, there's like legal briefings before, and there's like Green and Black legal, who do like, yeah, like the briefings about protest rights, and especially updated ones. And there's actually this new group called like Climate Action Support Pathway, and they are like this new group, and they are basically amazing, and they take you through, like, if you're planning to do like a direct action, they take you through like everything you need to know, and like potential financial costs. They can speak to your friends and family, so it's like really good. And like they've kind of developed out of like the Extinction Rebellion and like everything that's been happening over like the last 5 years. So it's always like making sure you have like gone to those briefings before, because there is like a lot of information and a lot of like knowledgeable people and experienced people, including Fi, out there to like share experiences. But also, like, yeah, you don't even have to like do that. Yeah, like we need everyone in this. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because the way that I've assessed things is I've never done an action if I have a pending charge for something else, because you'll also get affected if you have additional things. And for me, that's not my little role in the movement. That's not for me where my skills lie. And so if I'm going to do something, I want to be absolutely certain that I completely believe in that, and that me doing that specific action will have an effect. That's not the case for everyone. Some people will just be like, actually, I think the most important thing I can do right now is blockade an Amazon distribution centre, do a muck sit-in, as we called the McDonald's ones. And that's great, because that's their role. And it's quite common for people to do lots of different things. Like I've done a little bit of the arrest things. Occasionally I'll just sit and make placards and banners for protests, even though I'm not artistic in that way. But just keeping in mind that kind of main role and how it might compromise that as well.
Amazing. If no one else has any questions, should we just do a quick checkout? Is that okay, Fi? And then if you're happy to put like your Instagram or whatever, like for people to contact.
They're on my slides and it's shut now.
To be honest, they should be following you anyway, but you know. Yeah.
The chat.
Groovy chicks. Yeah, I'll check out first. I'm feeling good. Always feel a bit more boosted after these sessions. So yeah, and it's our final one, kind of our final one. We might do like a little like final one after next week. But yeah, thank you. I'll pass over to Megan.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a huge thank you. That was a fantastic session. Yeah, I'm feeling hopeful. So yeah, thanks, Fi.
Pass over to Bella.
Yeah, same here. Thank you. That was great, Fi. I'm feeling inspired to go and read up on the technicalities of getting arrested. I will pass over to Michelle.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really nice to hear about like the different kinds of ways that you can find yourself in the movement, as someone who can't be arrested for immigration reasons and various things like that. It's nice to hear, and also to know where to go in case I do want to do one of these things, if one day Priti Patel will let me. Passing on to Peter, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, really, it was really nice to hear your experience, Fi, and the honesty with which you shared that. That was really, really useful. And yeah, I think there's so much support and solidarity out there from people who are doing this. They've been doing it for 1 year, 40 years, and it's a really lovely part of the movement, I think, and a really important part for that inclusivity idea. So yeah, it was really lovely to hear your reflections. I'll pass to Elise.
Yeah, I'm feeling good. As Emma said, I always feel a bit better after the session. It's kind of inspiring, and yeah, it helped to balance all the negative feelings about eco-anxiety or just sometimes feeling overwhelmed. And thank you, Fi, for sharing your experience. I was really interested to see the process you went through and the different type of action you got involved in. So thank you.
Thank you so much to Emma for facilitating, and to everybody for just being here and sort of interacting with this. I really enjoy doing things like this, so it's really great when I can see people engaging with it. It gives me a lot of hope.
Amazing, that's what we need. Yeah, this isn't the last we've seen of you at the University of Exeter. I'm sure we'll do some other ones. So yeah, groovy chicks. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, the next session is with Rhiannon Osborne, and she's like a doctor and climate activist and does stuff with health for a Green New Deal, and like loads of other stuff. So that should be a really good one as well. And it also, like, I just like open these up now. So like, if you do know anyone who might want to come along, just let me know and I'll send them the like resource booklet and everything. So yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. And stay hopeful.
Yes.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.